How many of you have ever heard sex trafficking is due to supply and demand? This seems to be the mantra of most abolitionists who not only oppose sex trafficking, but any manner of sex work at all. Some of you, like me, find this hard to swallow because it seems an overly simplistic explanation of a very complex problem. It displays a purely superficial understanding of the very real problem of human trafficking, and the ferocity of those who defend this explanation, in spite of constant refutations of their arguments, reeks of willful ignorance. I am finding more and more that my work as a sex workers' rights advocate is not only about fighting for the rights of one marginalized group. In dispelling the disinformation and clearing up the conflations between sex work and trafficking, I have stumbled upon a whole group of people whose issues are being ignored because this simplistic explanation of the problem does not accommodate them.
The State Department puts out a report every year, the TIP report we call it, and
Trafficking in Persons.
Trafficking in Persons report, sorry. And they rank countries around the world, and I think it's up to about 106 countries, over 60 countries around the world. And I've done a lot of work. I worked in Indonesia for many years and did work about migrant workers being trafficked to Malaysia. And the majority of the cases I saw there were trafficking for forced labor on plantations, for domestic work. It was not trafficking into the sex sector. Yet the TIP report in about, I think it was 2002, about Malaysia only talked about trafficking into the sex sector. And I think that was partly because of the questions that the U.S. Embassy was asking when they were there. I'm not accusing the TIP office at all that they were trying to ignore the problem. They get their information a lot of the times from the U.S. Embassy, and I think it was because of the way they were defining it and the way they were asking the questions. And I raised this with the TIP office, and I'm pleased to say that, last year the report on Malaysia talks extensively about trafficking for other types of labor. And so, again, I just think it's how people are defining it and how they're looking at the issue.
Jyoti, you mentioned in your comments that you were surprised to see the number in India and Nepal being static over a 10, 15-year period. Has the problem gotten worse? There's an implicit assumption that the problem has gotten much worse, and I'm just wondering what has contributed to that. I mean, it seems as if certainly in the last 5, maybe 10 years, there's been a much greater awareness of the issues and a much greater understanding of some of these different components. And is it that we now are looking for it and we see it, it's always been there, or is it in fact getting worse?
I think it's a combination of factors. We're looking for it, so we see it. We're looking for it in other sectors, so we see it. But also, I think hardships have intensified. People are living in very difficult circumstances. For instance, just Nepal. You all know that it's been caught in conflict over a number of years, and the situation is very, very difficult. Over the last 3 months, my office, which has a large number of people in Nepal, have said that more than 1 million young people have fled the country and are in India, just trying to flee and survive, basically survive. So in some areas, yes, certainly the situation is such that it's driving people out, whether it's conflict situation or just economic hardship or erosion of livelihoods. So people are fleeing. That's why we see that there are many more migrants who are fleeing their borders, their countries. And when borders are becoming barriers in terms of very, very stringent migration and immigration policies, then there is a tendency for people who must leave and are desperate to leave, then to resort to clandestine ways of leaving their countries and fleeing their territories. So there is, I would say, common sense sort of logic which tells me that there is an increase in smuggling, and we see such reports coming to us all the time. And there is perhaps an increase in trafficking as well, just because it's very difficult to move through legal means. And I think at some level I can understand why it is important to have statistics. Because if I've been working in this area for God knows how many years now, I do want to know what is the impact of my work. Has it gone? Is it making a difference? Is trafficking being reduced as a part of what I've been doing? Is it staying static? Is it going up? And if it's going up, then what is it that I need to do? But it's very hard to get that impact assessment in terms of numbers because we don't really have methodologies. So what we're also trying to do is look at other ways to assess the impact of our work, which entails a lot of qualitative work, which is always very hard. But sharing that information. But I would say, just in a nutshell, again to come back to your question, simply because situations within which people are caught are getting worse, and because legal means to migrate are becoming very restrictive, there is a tendency for traffickers, smugglers, other agents who will facilitate travel for people who cannot travel by legal means to lead to an increase in trafficking as well.
Well, I want to kind of go both ways. On the one hand, we have anecdotal evidence from Central and Eastern Europe that, and maybe there's reports out there, I haven't actually come across any, that as people, originally when people were being trafficked out of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, it was because they couldn't migrate safely. They didn't know how to migrate illegally, without documents and safely, so that they had to use intermediaries. And so a lot of them ended up trafficked, as we all know, because we've all read the reports. But there's now anecdotal evidence that a lot of the people who in the past would have been trafficked are able to migrate safely. Whether they end up working legally or not is a different question, but they know where they're going, they know what they're doing, they have the networks, they have the routes, and so the difference between being trafficked and smuggled was really safe migration. On the other hand, we have evidence here in the Americas that, as Jody was mentioning, closing borders, as our borders have been closing and walls have been going up at the border in the U.S., we used to have seasonal migrant workers who would come in and work for a while, then they would go back home and they would invest in their communities, and their families would remain in those communities in Mexico and in Central America. But now those borders are closed, and it's very expensive. Where people used to be able to cross on their own, it was very inexpensive to cross, to have somebody carry them across the Rio Grande or whatever. Now they have to pay thousands of dollars, and it's very dangerous. They could die in the Arizona desert. People are dying. So that we end up having people who now come to the United States. First, usually it's men on their own, but sometimes with their wives, or it's now also young women on their own. They do not go back. We no longer have the money that was being made in the U.S. going back to help support families in Mexico and build and have the family community there. So what you have is then the wives start following them. They also stay. They don't go back. And the new phenomenon, it's not all that new, but it's a phenomenon over a number of years, is that these people are leaving their children with relatives or friends in their communities in Central America or Mexico. Those relatives end up maybe migrating themselves, or the kids become teenagers and they're not really controllable, and they wander off into communities and work on their own. And then they try to come to the United States with a little piece of paper that has an address of someplace in Los Angeles, and they're looking for their families, right? So they come across the borders into Mexico, and the U.S. is now working with Mexico to tighten up on the border with Guatemala. It is extremely dangerous at that border right now, and these children and young women are coming across the borders, and the smugglers have control of all the routes. So these people end up then being trafficked, right? So we have this situation where youth are traveling on their own. They're being trafficked because our border's closed and they need to reunite. They're looking for their families. A lot of these children are ending up on trains in Mexico where they get thrown off the trains and they lose limbs. Other women are being caught at the borders in Mexico, and their money is taken away from them. They're all raped. I know somebody who interviewed women in a detention center in Mexico City. I only talked to her after she interviewed 20 of them. Now she's interviewed 100. But all 20 of the women that she interviewed in Central America said that before they left home, they started taking birth control pills because they all knew they were going to be raped on the route. So we have a situation that if you start looking back to why did this all change, of course there's instability in the region, but we in our end have a lot of accountability for it. So we have that kind of cause of increase. And then on the other hand, we see in Central and Eastern Europe where there's more safe migration, there's a decrease in trafficking. And I'm actually going in a couple weeks to the border with Guatemala and Mexico to try to find out more about what is really happening.
But Anne, as a solution to this, to say the United States should throw open its borders isn't going to fly. So how do you try to come up with some constructive policies that can address some of these issues?
Well, obviously, we all know that there's this huge migration debate going on in the country right now. I would like this to be included in that debate, right? I would like us as country of destination, just as in many other countries of destination, to stop pretending that it is a problem of the countries of origin. That we have got to be spending all of our money overseas to try to educate and train border officials and everybody else how to tell people to stop migrating. That is not a plan that is really going to work. I mean, I think we have to be more willing to look at all of the factors involved, including the situations in our own countries that help create an environment in which people can be made extremely vulnerable and trafficked. So I don't myself have a solution. I just want that part of be included in this discussion so we can come up with one.
The root causes of international human trafficking are the differential development of countries leading to the separations between the first, second, and third worlds. Lack of job opportunities that pay a living wage, because when there is no work to be had, one must venture out to find it. And an inability of people to migrate freely and safely, because when they cannot, they must pay others to help them. They must pay these people and trust them with their lives and bodies. And if they trust the wrong person, what will they do when they are far away from home, penniless, and possibly unable to speak the language? So no, the cause of international sex trafficking isn't supply and demand, it's poor immigration policy. If abolitionists really cared about fighting it, they would be fighting for immigration reform and positive economic development in the most common host countries of these victims. Yet all we hear about from them is prostitution and pornography. So let's say, for argument's sake, they were being totally honest with you, and severe sex trafficking was the main form of human trafficking. Prostitution is not where these people start, it's where they end up. So I ask you, what is this about? Really?